Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happenstance into this Truth Bomb riff conversation. It is my great pleasure. I'm humbled to be joined by none other than Jennifer Taub. And if you are a fan of important information, not a fan, I'm going to sound like a fanboy for a minute because I've completely dove into, immersed myself in your work at Jen Taub Live on YouTube. And I got to be honest with you, Jennifer. It's like, and I hope you don't mind me calling you Jennifer. I want to be courteous to your professional designation, but just for the dialogue, because you
Oh
do.
no, please. You can call me anything. It's fine.
Thank you. You make yourself so accessible, considering the breadth of knowledge that you have. And I'll say this off the top for those of you who are consistent listeners to this program. Jennifer is literally the legal Mike Tyson, Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods in his prime. I mean, she is a powerhouse of knowledge that, Jennifer, I wish you were in prime time every night with tens of millions of people watching you. But until that happens, I'll do a quick introduction first and just be grateful that I'm talking to you. A quick background on Jennifer's education. She has a BA in English from Yale University, a JD from Harvard Law School. Her background is that she's a legal scholar and advocate devoted to making complex business law topics engaging inside and outside of the classroom. Her research and writing focuses on corporate governance, banking and financial market regulation, and white collar crime. Similarly, her advocacy centers on Follow the Money Matters, promoting transparency and opposing corruption. And she's also a professor at Western New England University School of Law. And she has an
Wait,
amazing.
wait, 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 wait. I gotta cut you off. I changed schools. I'm now at Wayne State University in Detroit.
Oh, I saw that, and I think I know why. And I'm so sorry for the
That's
passing of
okay.
your mother.
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well,
I moved back home when she was well. I mean, and now this is my beautiful condo in Midtown Detroit, also known as the Cass Corridor. So I love it here. I love being back home.
well, that's fantastic. I came to know you initially when you joined us with a prestigious group of people where we premiered our work, The Con, in 2021. And I don't think you had any idea what The Con was at that time. But I reached out to you because of your book, Big Dirty Money: The Shocking Injustice of Unseen Cost of White Collar Crime. And then you also are well known for having organized the tax march in 2017 and to demand the release of President Trump's tax returns. And by the way, I interact quite a bit with David K. Johnson, which is really
I
cool,
love him. Yeah.
magnificent. And then also you wrote with the late Kathleen Brickley of Corporate and White Collar Crime Cases, Materials, sixth and seventh editions. And there's
The eighth
more.
one just came out this last week. Yeah, that's the yeah. The other thing I want to say to you is I wrote a book on the financial crisis
Yeah,
called Other People's Houses, which
yeah.
is sort of up your alley given your expertise.
Well, right. And I was, just about to go into that, but I mean, I'll include in the description for everybody links to what I just prefaced and more. But I mean, look, Jennifer, crazy times, like you say, I don't have the production value at the moment, but I got to tell you, I love Crazy Train or Crazy Town, the song
Do,
that you
do,
do.
do, do, do. The end of the
Absolutely.
show.
Yeah. And we're brothers, sisters in arms about really kind of what undergirds really why you're making yourself so accessible, considering the depth and breadth of knowledge that you have. But I mean, I'm just going to say what your husband's artwork reveals: fuck fascism, and I'll include
Yeah,
that down below as well. But I wanted to get this conversation started as I generally tend to with these dialogues, which is to respond to what's kind of in this never-ending cycle of just so much information that it's hard to keep track of everything. But boy, but I will say at the outset, I've never seen anybody manage to be able to keep as much information as tight, as robust as you do during Gen Top Live. So I want to react to really first and foremost the unbelievable record-setting, record-breaking filibuster by Cory Booker last night, where he went the distance and out performed. I couldn't believe it. Strom Thurmond, I didn't even know this going into it, but Strom Thurmond filibustered for 24 hours and 18 minutes, which was the previous record. to basically filibuster the 1957 Civil Rights Act. And then, of course, Cory Booker's outstanding performance last night that was so heroic and so inspiring. But at the same time, it created some momentum. And of course, in the same 24-hour cycle, we're looking at the victory of Susan Crawford against Elon Musk's showering of literally transparent corruption in the Wisconsin state, a Supreme Court election. Anyway, I think that's a good place to start. I mean, what is your reaction to those two initially?
I love how you have framed them as being sort of at the same time and interrelated, because I do think that's the case. While Cory Booker was on this marathon filibuster, he managed to bring in to the dialogue or dialogue monologue these letters that he had received from people, citizens of Wisconsin, concerned about Elon Musk, this unaccountable, drug-addled, kleptocratic billionaire, in interference in their election. They were very concerned, and as part of his, monologue, he read some of those letters. And I think that might have influenced people who might not have, gotten up to vote. Sometimes the weather is gloomy. Sometimes you're feeling, does it really matter? It's a special election. Turnout isn't as great. And she nailed that, and she won, and she proved, as I think she said in her acceptance speech, who knew that, a small, a young girl who came from this small town in Wisconsin would go up against the world's richest man and win. And so I do think Booker may have, because you had hundreds of millions of people watching him. Some of those were Wisconsin voters, right? We saw that like on TikTok, he had like 350 million likes. That indicates, international scope of his words. But I think that helped motivate that. And I also think that the voters in Wisconsin, as well as the people who push Cory Booker to come forward, like his constituents, are ready for something different, not just laying down and playing dead, like James Carville says the Democrats should do.
Well, and one of the things, I mean, we'll take what we can get, given the onslaught of Doge and just this incredibly horrific rug pull of our democracy by this lawless presidency and the fascism that it's, in the midst of. But the nature of Susan Crawford's statement I found interesting, and I think we should acknowledge and then maybe touchstone upon it and move forward. But she said, you know what, justice can't be bought. And I'm sorry to say, for those of us who've been paying attention for a long time, should I mention the Supreme Court?
Why not? I mean, when you say justice can't be bought, I'm thinking of at least one and maybe two who certainly can be buttered up, wined and dined, and yachted and flown.
Yeah, well, by the way, I don't know if you remember this. When we did our panel, this was a long time ago. It was in 2021, but we were the panel was orchestrated by Jesse Eisinger of the ProPublica, and his outfit and his operation were responsible for, of course, the revelations of all things Clarence Thomas and Harlan Crow and so forth. And I can't remember the name off the top of my head. The hedge fund guy that's been in there, the Opus Dei guy, who's been very influential as well. Does that ring a bell to you? You know who I'm talking about? The
Are you talking about Leonard Leo?
Yes, I'm talking about Leonard Leo. So
Okay.
anyway,
I
yeah,
didn't know he's yeah.
but that was ProPublica's work, and it stemmed
Yes.
from Eisinger. Which again, these truths. I mean, I never in a million years would have suspected that we would have seen the revelation of that sort of scenario that would lead to the upside down American distress. Which, by the way, abolitionists used during slavery, before slavery. But here we had Samuel Alito. But I mean, I wonder how
His
you.
wife, his wife, and put it up on the flagpole, and he doesn't have working hands, so he couldn't like bring it down. It was out of his power.
Right. Well, but I mean, do you feel like you might want to comment? Because I haven't. I mean, I've dove in. I've probably seen 25 of your live Truth Bomb. I mean, excuse me, Jennifer Taub live, where you've covered a whole gamut. But I haven't heard in this particular run that I've visited, and I'm kind of bouncing around in time periods, but they're all just as
Sure.
relevant today as they're 2 months ago, 3 months ago. I mean, everything's playing up, but I'm just wondering if you've got a comment about the Supreme Court, because I know you talked about Merrick Garland quite a bit. Can we start with the Supreme Court?
Sure. I'm of the view that you don't even need a constitutional amendment in order to, under Article 3, to limit the time frame in which a Supreme Court justice can serve. The way the language works in Article 3 says that they will hold office, I think it's um, they will hold office like while they're in good standing. Let me tell you the actual language. But the idea is the office, how long the office, or the definition of the office, the position isn't in the Constitution. And so there's no reason why it has to be an office available for life. So I think one of the things that is really easy to do. Oh, sorry, here it's judges holding their offices during good behavior. So that could be done. Now that could get challenged because what does good behavior mean? Historically, does that mean, I'm sorry, what does the office mean? Doesn't that just mean for life? But what's also available, even more clear, is the court could easily be expanded, right? It's not always had 9 justices. And given that altogether there are 13 circuits, instead of just 9, there's 12 uh, plus the district for the District of Columbia, et cetera. We've got these 13 circuits. Why don't we have 13 justices? That Congress could do with a willing president. And I'm really I think one of the reasons why Joe Biden didn't go there is because when he had that big committee, there wasn't consensus among academia, and I think he got timid. But in terms of the justices themselves, yeah, I think someone like Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito could have and should have been impeached based on the corruption that we saw. Uh, and whether it's not, oh, sorry, Leonard Leo is the guy who is influencing. You met Harlan Crow, I think. I mean, maybe you met
Well, I
Leonard
mentioned
Leo.
Harlan Crow.
Yeah, but Harlan Crow and Leonard Leo, the influence that they had, I think there's enough to bring impeachment against them, but it's not going to win in the Senate. So I think these guys are terribly corrupt. I also think, there's no remedy for it, but I think many of the conservative Supreme Court justices basically perjured themselves at their confirmation hearings because they misled the public deliberately on their desire to overturn Roe versus Wade. There's no question that they were gunning for it and that they sort of were too cute by half when they were like, well, it's established precedent. Well, that's something's only established precedent until it's not. So Donald Trump put them on the court so that they could take away a woman's right to choose. And we've seen also ProPublica do incredible work on how the states that are most restrictive of abortion are having more stillborn babies, women dying of sepsis. Someone who wants to be a mother who doesn't just lose a child or doesn't get to have her child, but also dies in the process of a miscarriage, doesn't get to live her life, doesn't get to be, a mother in the future. This seems to be outrageous that the Constitution doesn't protect a woman's life in this way.
Well, yeah, interesting, because where my head has been in this context of the question of expanding the Supreme Court to 13 justices, giving all things of the Roberts Court, but everything that Mitch McConnell and the, Libertarian Koch-funded Heritage Foundation has been pulling off behind the scenes for now decades, right, leading to this situation. I recall listening to Lawrence Tribe's assessment of the 14th Amendment, Section 3, obviously, that
Mhm.
led to, of course, the Colorado case. And we saw, 6 months before the election, I mean, we got the red flag right there that they were knighting, the most corrupt president, criminal president in history, a king, to put him above the law. And yet, I'm curious what your thoughts were at that time period, given when you look at the language, and obviously you're the scholar, I'm just a regular everyday guy, but when I read that language in the Constitution Amendment, the 14th Amendment, Section 3, knowing the context of the Civil War and why they put in there that you can't run for office if you were involved with an insurrection. I know that they, had suggested that maybe this wasn't really an insurrection, but that's just as ridiculous as the gaslighting from, of course, Tucker Carlson and the lying Fox platform. What were you thinking at that time period when you saw that decision come down?
Well, as a matter of fact, Larry or Lawrence Tribe, Larry and I and Judge Luttig were all three acting as legal advisors to free speech for people who was bringing. I think they brought the case in Minnesota, trying to. Was it Minnesota? There was Colorado, and then I want to say there was another state, I think it was Minnesota, to
Yeah,
try to keep
that's
Donald
what I
Trump
thought.
off the ballot. So I was on, Zoom and calls and conversations with him, and he was my constitutional law professor back in law school, although I was hardly a remarkable student at the time. I was mostly arguing with him on arcane things and not actually stepping up and doing what I was probably supposed to do. But anyway, I apologize years later. He's been very supportive of my career since then. But um, I agree, of course, with Larry that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment does prohibit someone like Donald Trump, um, does allow judges, I'm sorry, to have require judges to have hearings to decide whether someone should be kicked off of the ballot. And what I would say is, I also believe, I'm just pulling up the statute, the language. I also believe that it's self-effectuating because that was one of the arguments that they made in Colorado, which is no, you need Congress to enact a law to give this portion of the 14th Amendment effect. And that seems to be incorrect to me and inconsistent with other aspects of the 14th Amendment, including the due process provisions for which you do not need, for example, Congress to act in order to only the Supreme Court had to act, for example, regarding personal jurisdiction. I don't want to get too much into the weeds. I would also say that Judge Luttig had a really interesting interpretation of that, saying that it wasn't about kind of insurrection or rebellion against the United States necessarily. He thought it was insurrection or rebellion um, against the Constitution itself. Anyway, I fully agree. I don't think the Supreme Court made the right decision, but at the end of the day, they have the votes, and that's what we're stuck with.
Well, I mean, there was not 24-hour cable television, obviously, at the end of the Civil War either, right? And so we saw the whole thing play out. And I wonder how that would be juxtaposed in the interpretation by legal scholars, because we saw the insurrection take place. That's why the gaslighting was so incredible to me, and the follow up and the big lie and everything that it led to, of course. But, I want to circle back to just some kind of establishing questions because you are such a scholar, you are such a heavyweight in
Well, I just want to be really clear. I'm not a constitutional law scholar, and I'm kind of like, I got into academia after being in the corporate world and being,
right.
doing finance. So, in some ways, the word scholar, I know that technically maybe that's what I am, but I don't know. When people say that, I always feel,
Well, I'm sorry.
you know,
Okay, well then
no,
I'll
no, no, no.
backpedal.
It's so funny because I think I'm not trying to undersell myself, but I just want to be clear. Like, Larry Tribe is a constitutional law scholar.
Sure.
I do white collar crime. I don't do it. I'm white collar crimes, securities regulation and banking. And I only deal with con law at the intersection of money and politics. And so I always say that because, the con law scholars are, you know, they're like, they hold themselves out in a different way. And if they hear you actually publicly claiming to be one, then God knows what will happen. They'll be whispering about me at the water cooler next time I see them. So,
Well, thank you for that clarification, and I'll be careful not to
oh,
overblow your. But look, from where I'm sitting, it's a completely different structure. But look, let's just start with some basic questions then, because obviously I want to get into the most important aspect of it, where our journeys intersect, which is going to be all things white collar fraud. But I wonder if you could just, for those kind of listening, construct a definition of the law from where you're sitting in your career, and what is the law, what is the importance of the law? It seems like a silly question, but I'd love to hear how you define that.
I love really abstract questions like that because I sometimes, when I used to teach contracts to first year law students, I would start out with a fundamental question. What is a contract? And the basic definition, for example, of a contract are a promise or promises that the law will enforce. So then we spend the whole semester getting into the nuances of well, what actually is a promise, and which are the ones that are enforceable and what is meant by law. So I'll strip all of that away and say, law in the United States can mean many different things. We have the state level and we have the federal level. So law can mean statutes enacted by the state legislature and signed by the governor, or at the federal level, something a law Congress passes, right? And then the president signs. Law can also mean the rules and regulations that are created or promulgated by agencies empowered by Congress or the state legislature. Law can also mean um, at the state level, this common law, case judge made law going on and on and on. But law can also mean the US Constitution at the top of it. And so what I think about, I'm going to do law in the books versus like law in the streets, though. Fundamentally, what law means, if you think about the way I think about statutes that are on the books or the Constitution, think about them as an evergreen tree. Like the Constitution's like the tree, the evergreen tree, or a statute. Well, the US Constitution sort of at the top, let's say, or a state constitution, but let's use federal law. We've got the Constitution, it's like this evergreen tree. And one branch, let's say it's the First Amendment, or another branch is Article 3 of, setting out what the judiciary is or what have you. Another thing might be the 14th Amendment. And the plain language of it is just the tree. But you can't look at the plain language to understand its meaning because there are these ornaments hanging on it. And to me, the ornaments are all the cases and decisions interpreting that. So to me, like law is like this decorated, illuminated evergreen tree, which, over the years, some ornaments break and you put a new one on. Like it's sort of like people talk about the living constitution or law that evolves. And to me, the case decisions that keep up, some are traditional, you take them out every year, some are new things. And to me, that's what sort of the body, that's my metaphor for the body of law. Now, that's a really sort of like simplistic view. If you take the view of law in the situation we're in right now, whether it's a current fascist regime or before creeping oligarchy, where there are two sets of rules for ordinary people versus the white, wealthy, and well connected, I would say that for the people in power, law protects, is how we think of it. And for people who don't have power, law binds. Another way of saying this is in, fascist Germany, or, Ernst Frankl had this observation. He wrote a book called The Dual State, this idea that there are two kind of governments. There's one, there's law that is, or a state, like the state that is the normative state, where here are all the rules, here are the laws you have to abide by. And then there's above that, the prerogative state, where if you're connected through the regime, then law gives you special prerogatives. So those are various answers to what law is. And then, that's law.
Well, and my shortcut to that has always been, and what I realized post 2008, for example, is the law serves up and comes down hard. And that discrepancy, both in wealth and unfortunately in knowledge, as to how our system is supposed to function, obviously is, equated or equals Donald Trump, right? And MAGA. And to that point,
And I should say that, let me just be really clear. Like I'm acting like, oh, here's a Christmas tree and that's the law. Well, of course, it's not really. It's something that's created by people, right? That whoever gets the laws get made and get amended by people who have access, who have knowledge, who have power, and it's hard to undo them. And even though Justice Roberts is famous for saying, "Oh, judges just call balls and strikes."
right.
And first of all, that's absolutely not true. They're not calling balls and strikes. They're whether they're interpreting a statute or deciding whether something complies with the U.S. Constitution or whatever they're doing within the rubric of their jurisdiction. There's a lot of discretion as to what they do. And secondly, so many things don't get reviewed by the Supreme Court. And as we know, if you don't have money and time and power, you don't get to either as a defendant use all of the laws that could protect you, or as someone suing, drag a lawsuit out to crush somebody. And you can see Donald Trump being on both sides, the offense and the defense, using law as a weapon or as a shield, not as a tool for justice or a tool for fairness.
Yeah, give me my Roy Cohn, and then some.
Yes, right.
Well, I mean, and by the same token, I'll ask you then if you could kind of give me, I don't think it's an esoteric question from where I'm sitting, but I can't wait to see how you answer this one. What is fraud? What is fraud?
Okay, so you're talking to a law professor, right? And so I can give you a legal definition of fraud if you're looking for that as a basic, and then I can step back and tell you as a human, well, ethically what it is. So
Well, but
fraud.
to that point though, but
Oh,
this is the magic of what I've discovered on Gen Taub Live is that you're able to take these unbelievably complex subjects and then make them so, quite frankly, comprehensive to the regular person can understand, and that's kind of the sort of rubric that I'm asking the question in.
you know, the secret to that is I can't understand something unless I break it down myself. I just can't. So if I think it's like the way Warren Buffett says, if I don't understand how a business makes its money,
Yeah.
I don't invest. Like he used to say that he would take like, the annual report, right? It's called a 10K. He would take that and he'd make notes. You know, he'd sit down with his Diet Cokes. I guess I have Coke Zeros, but he would sit down and mark it. And if he had too many red marks or pencil marks, at some point, a few pages in, he would just say, I'm not going to invest. And for me, if I don't I can't give up on learning something. But if I think I'm just going to parrot what I read, if I don't understand it, I can't teach it. So, and then I can't teach, right? I mean, okay, so what I think of fraud basically is when someone intentionally uses deception. So when someone intentionally lies or uses deception to deprive another person of money or property, that's fraud. And that could be a civil offense where you sue someone civilly in court for fraud, or it could be a criminal offense at the state or federal level. At the federal level, because in order to have something have jurisdiction nationwide, the major fraud, so call it major fraud, the basic fraud statutes are called mail fraud and wire fraud. And it makes you think someone has to be, knocking over, someone with the your postal delivery guy and stealing the mail. That's not it. It just means that the mail or private courier like UPS has to have been used to further the offense. And they added wire fraud some years later because now basically it's the same idea that you're intentionally using, a false statement or deception to deprive someone of money or property or engaging in a scheme to do that. That's as long as you use a telephone or the internet or what have you, a wire, that's wire fraud. If you only use the mail, a private courier, that's mail fraud. That's basically the statutes. And then you go beyond those. When people talk about securities fraud, it means that you've used something defined as a security. So think of it as an investment, right? There's Medicare fraud. Basically, there's bank fraud. Every formulation of fraud is basically based on lies or deceptions to deprive someone of money or property.
So effectively, it's deceptive acts and practices for theft.
Yes. But the difference between making something just a civil case or criminal is the level of intent, right?
I
Like
was
if,
going to follow up with that
yeah,
intent. And the only way you can actually indict and convict is through discovery, correct?
well, uh, discovery is the word we use to apply to civil cases, not criminal cases, where both parties exchange documents. But you mean when it comes to a federal crime, um, we wouldn't call it discovery necessarily. We would just call it they have to have evidence
Got
of
it. Well,
the
what would come from
intent.
investigations and all of the other things that go with
Right,
it. So
right.
then, by the same token, then, can you define corruption?
So that's interesting. In my book, Big Dirty Money, I talked about how there are varying definitions of corruption. There's huge debates, right? So on the one hand, there's someone like who I adore, like Zephyr Teachout, who literally wrote the book on corruption. I think it's called Corruption in America, right? And she has a very capacious, very big view of what corruption is. And then there's this other guy, a professor at Harvard, also in the law school, who I got introduced to when I visited there as a professor. It was right before COVID. He's also a corruption expert, Matthew Stevenson, but he has a much more narrow idea. And so let me tell you both, I'll tell you sort of generally, the word corruption itself, forgetting law, I looked this up in Latin. Corruption is like corrode, right? It means to, I think it means to damage or I can look up the specifics. But essentially, it's to like to corrode, right? When you think about corroding something, um, you're thinking about harming or debasing in some way, right? And then when we think about, let me use the broad definition of corruption. I think a very broad, like the Zephyr teach-up idea of corruption, something that I would also subscribe to. Corruption could be private, it could be public. But for the most part, when we think of corruption, we're thinking about somebody using um, an office or a position of trust to serve themselves as opposed to the people who trusted them, right? So public corruption is you're using your public office, that's an office of trust. You're supposed to be serving the public interest, and yet you're pocketing things for your own benefit, right? Self-dealing. Another, the private corruption would be you're a guardian for someone who's young, or you're a guardian for someone who's incapacitated because they're elderly, or you're a trust, you're a lawyer working for someone, and you're using your position of trust. You're supposed to be looking out for these folks, and you're lining your own pockets. You're double dealing. So to me, corruption is doing any of those things. Now, someone like Matthew Stevenson, I think, would have a more narrow view, and I don't want to mischaracterize what he's saying, but just on the most basic level, he would tie corruption only much closely with very little daylight between illegal actions and corruption. So if there's not a law in the books, I don't know that he would say, or if there wasn't a contract requiring you to act in a certain way, he wouldn't necessarily consider it corrupt. So let me give you an example, and I'm going to put him off to the side. The US Supreme Court and reviews congressional statutes around bribery and corruption. And the main statute is 18 USC 2001. That's the main bribery of public officials statute. And there's two major cases. I won't go into the weeds on this, but according to the Supreme Court, two different unanimous decisions on corruption. They basically have decided that there is nothing legally prohibited right now. Congress has no law and to prohibit, they believe, selling access. So selling access, like even in the case of this is, the case of the governor of Virginia at one point, even letting your big donor give you cash for your daughter's wedding, access to a car, vacations, etc. This sounds a lot like Clarence Thomas. Getting stuff like that just as a gift, to have access, to have your ear, does not rise to the level of corruption, according to the US Supreme Court, even though the statute says that they're doing it for a reason. If you cannot have evidence of a specific quid pro quo where someone said, hey, can you imagine this? Someone saying this, I want to give you $5 million so you'll do exactly what I want. Now, Donald Trump does say shit like that, but can you imagine anyone other than him or Elon Musk? That's a separate issue. Back in the day, people wouldn't say those things. So you would have no proof. It's just like, oh, they just gave money to support me because they like me, right? Recently, though, we've had, Bob Menendez finally got busted and finally convicted at long last on that. We have Elon Musk, although he's not a, this is corruption, not bribery. He may have criminally violated some statutes in Wisconsin because there's a corruption statute about paying someone to vote in a certain way. So to me, corruption goes to either, like I said, abusing a public office or interfering in something to, I would say, like election interference would also pass for me as corruption. So corrupting the process by injecting too much money into it. I think the Citizens United decision invited corruption, right? Someone like Matthew Stevenson wouldn't label it that way. Someone like Zephyr Teachout and I would. All right, I'm so fucking long-winded.
No, just like I said, I wish I could talk to you for days, and obviously we're going to cut
We'll
to
have
chase.
another chance.
I hope so. We're coming to last quarter of the conversation, and there's so much to go over. I want to be thoughtful. You've already established that you're not a constitutional expert, but I just want to ask you a basic question then to kind of, put a fine tooth point on this. So when I consider our democracy and I consider the founding sort of um, impetus of separation of powers and the logistics of just coming out of a revolution against the most powerful paradigm on the planet at that time through King George III. And we know that it was not just King George III. Of course, it was Parliament. It's the muscle of the military and the Royal Navy, and also there was the East India Trading Company, and it was all part of this context. And so when they were writing about separation of powers, obviously it occurred to them that the enemy to this, this newly formed democracy in the tradition and the philosophical thought that they all had as founders, given all the flaws that they also had. But do you think they could have ever conceived or perceived, if you will? And I guess I'm looking at your definition of democracy in this sort of response, but in context to all of the things that matter to make that democracy function, i.e., the credibility and the integrity of the politicians that are voted into office to manage the democracy of by and for the people, but within the context of the fourth estate, i.e., freedom of the press. And all of those things are completely have been rug pulled and kneecapped with this Doge billionaire circus with the most criminal president in the history of the United States, at least that I'm aware of. Can you try to piece those together?
So I think I saw a question there. I'm going to pretend I'm going to answer the question that I think I heard in there, or the one I want to create. And I'm going to break it into two parts. One, I do think the founders understood human nature as you're getting at this and worried about concentrations of power. So let's start with that. And and there's something I don't think they would have anticipated that a president or a whole political party would get behind something they call the unitary executive, where they have decided that a single man or a single office of the presidency is the entire executive branch. That is Looney Tunes. So let me start with the first part and then do the second real quick on um, on the first part, which is they saw what happened with the divine right of kings. They saw, as you noticed, you noted the corruption of, they didn't like being a colony where they couldn't control their own destiny. They didn't want a king. They also wanted checks on powers, right? And they didn't create a parliamentary system. I mean, if you read um, Adam Winkler's book, We the Corporations, he kind of explains that the Constitution, in his view, is like a corporate charter more than it's like a parliamentary structure. But that's a conversation for a different day. But they set this thing up to make sure we wouldn't have concentrations of powers, to understand that if you had enough balance, then the worst people, if they got control of one part, would balance out the other people, or maybe people with self-interest would balance each other out. They kind of got that. As to the second part, which comes from the first, there's no way that the president of the United States was meant to be the whole executive branch. We call him the chief, we call it the executive branch, and we consider him the head of it. But think of the word that our founders used. They didn't use king, they used the word president. What does the word president come from? To preside. To me, a president is presiding over the executive branch, and not not an executive, not the one who makes all of the decisions necessarily. And in fact, we know he doesn't create laws. Congress does. He just signs them or vetoes them. And if there's enough will behind it, the Congress can override his veto, right? We also know that he's supposed to oversee aspects of, he's the commander in chief of the military, right? So this, I think that they would think that was crazy. And on top, crazy as they would think that we would have someone claim that a president is the whole executive branch as opposed to presiding over it. I do think that they would be just gobsmacked by the idea that a rich foreigner who gets gobs of money, billions of dollars from the US government, would be giving the keys to literally the keys to the kingdom to break down what was put in place by legitimate administrations elected by the people without any accountability and engage in all kinds of corruption, self-dealing, and fraud. And that somehow the Congress would put up with it. I don't think they would have fully anticipated because we didn't really have political parties. They were against factions at that time. I don't think they could have perceived that no one would put the brakes on this kind of bullshit.
And thanks again for that sort of, plain speak. And we're, don't have a lot of time left, but the nature of what you just said, and I appreciate you digging out the question and ferreting it out because that's what I was hoping to hear. Because in the nature of this abomination, right? My come from has always been never again. Okay, fascism is something that I put at the highest platitudes of my existence, and everything is a red flag when I see that going up, and it's been going up for a long time in a very big way. And it's very convoluted and very scary on a global basis right now. And we could go into all sorts of different dialogues about that. But my shortcut has always been corruption births and fuels fascism. In that I always knew from the standpoint of it doesn't matter what engineering that is, a bridge doesn't stand, a plane doesn't fly, a building or a ship doesn't float without the integrity of the system. And so I asked all of those questions because you are the expert in fraud. And we haven't even been able to get into all of under the hood of all things 2008 and where we are. But I'll just kind of preface it from this standpoint. A lot of people are questioning themselves, like, how is it possible that a billionaire that is, the largest contributor to the Trump presidency can come in unelected, oversee this agency that's not an agency, and kneecap illegally with all of the other things that are coming at us on a daily basis through this Doge that is just an abomination, that's an assault on all of the elements of the federal government. And all of the, I'm sure there's problems as well, but for the most part, my God, between Social Security and Veterans Administration and benefits and all of the rest, this is just an unbelievable rug pull that a lot of people are like, how is this possible? And for anyone paying attention to the past 14 years, seeing the ever creeping power of the billionaire and billionaire apparatus that has been above the law and quite frankly, above market forces as well, how do you, in this moment, even though I see you do it every day on Taub Live, especially when you do the crazy dance, but you are able to disseminate this sort of hopeful sort of, we're going to come together. We know that I think on Saturday, April 5th is this day of protest, which is going to be very inspiring. We've just come out of the Cory Booker scenario. And obviously, like we talked about before, the victory over Elon in Wisconsin. But again, what happened during the 2008 great financial crisis, and there's been a whole lot that's happened since that has created this empire of billionaires above the law, which is where we started with the disparity of the law, which is the disparity of everything else. So can you kind of take us home in the next, closing statement to kind of the perspective of this moment and how you're reading it and what people can expect to hear from you on your YouTube page as well, and like what you hope to achieve in this moment.
What I hope to achieve is people being able to have open eyes and see what is in front of us without panicking or feeling incredible despair. And knowing that terrible things can happen and we live through them, right? If you at all understanding of the existence of your own mortality, then you can grapple with the idea that we are here on a longer trajectory than our own time on the planet or even our children or our grandchildren. And so if you're looking at big systems and you see the movement of ourselves through time, like we don't have feudalism anymore, right? But we are also in a big, powerful shift in the United States and maybe globally at the moment, rejecting a certain kind of democracy, representative democracy that we have expected. but it didn't happen overnight with Donald Trump, right? And so figuring out that maybe in some ways these massive efforts he's undergoing could create the kind of situation where people will really create change. I mean, after the 2008 financial crisis, we didn't go far enough, but we did a lot to reform certain aspects of the banking system. And I do believe that we can do better. I think stars like Alexander Ocasio-Cortez, and I think what Cory Booker did yesterday, I think that as we begin to understand over a longer period of time what it could be like when we could have more human flourishing, when we could say, let's really try for shared prosperity. Look what it looks like if we empower these really rapacious, self centered douchebags to run things. So for me, when it's right in our face, I'm like, okay, maybe we're getting to the part of the movie when we can have a turnaround, right? I want to be here beyond the dark part. I'm waiting not for the happy ending because there's always a sequel, but I'm waiting for the epiphany. I'm waiting for the joy. And I'm waiting to, quite honestly, as Elvis Costello so eloquently wrote about Maggie Thatcher, I'm waiting to tramp the dirt down on Donald Trump's grave whenever that happens.
Right on. Oh, I love that. And by the way, I grew up with Joe Strummer, so I definitely know the era well. Um, Look, just a couple of more things on the way out of here. So that's hopeful, and I appreciate that. But we also know that there are people like yourself that are technically there's got to be a marriage between those that know the system, those that know how to remedy in the system, and those that need to help build the critical mass of an informed populace that then can put the power in the people's hands who demonstrate that relationship of by and for the people as opposed to of by and for the corruption, right? Which is what we've
Right.
been in the midst of for a long time. And so, one thing we discovered in our work was yeah, RICO is something that matters. And so, in the grand context, I wonder if you could maybe just give a quick summation of RICO in the context of your knowledge of financial crimes. But I feel like the whole system is a racketeering and corrupt organization at the moment.
So, Patrick, I want to answer that, but we may have to cut it off right after you said right on. I'm not live right now. Are we live?
No.
Okay, because I have some guy delivering the washer dryer to my condo and he's downstairs in front of my flippin' building.
Well, Jennifer had to take off because she's in the midst of life, and she wanted to finish up at another time because she had a previous appointment that showed up early. Unfortunately, she's in the midst of selling a house. And I want to thank Jennifer for her time and thank you for tuning in. And until next time, we'll reconnect with Jennifer on this subject and hopefully we'll be able to delve further into the whole notion that our whole system is racketeering and corrupt, quite frankly. So thank you to you all for tuning in. And until next time, onwards and upwards.